So, hello and welcome, and sorry that you were waiting. Um, I'm Andrew Fanning. I'm the Data Analysis and Research Lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. I'm very, very happy to welcome you all to this public webinar that we're hosting about co-creating methods to downscale the donut. And I'm joined here today with my colleague, Kate Rayworth, as well as other members of the deal team, Rob Shorter, who's the Communities and Art Lead, Leonora Gerchava, who is our Cities and Regions Lead, Karen Bianco, who is the Digital Communications Lead. And we also have a couple different groups who will be joining us throughout this webinar, which is Yannick Baudouin, who is with the David Suzuki Foundation, and Peggy Anchovis and Sharon Almarigi, who are from the Regenerate Barbados Initiative. And before I jump in with a little bit of introduction on the agenda and what we have in mind, I wanted to acknowledge, that I was actually born in Canada. So this webinar is focused more on the Americas time zone. So I'm feeling a little bit more at home, so to speak. But I wanted to acknowledge that I was born in Halifax, which is the traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq peoples. And I thought that I would invite just all of us to consider the lands and the impacts that our ancestors have had upon others, no matter where you may be in the world, as a way to begin. And I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking in English, which is my mother tongue, but it's not the case for everybody. So thank you all for taking an additional effort if it's not your first language. And finally, as well, the time zone issue is I really would like to recognize that people are dialing in. It might be the morning, it might be the afternoon, it might be the evening, and we're very grateful that you have joined at whatever time it may be. So the purpose of this webinar today is actually really exciting, and I have been working quite hard with the team over the past year or so, thinking about this portrait methodology that we're going to be discussing today and the adaptations that we've been making with it, not just ourselves at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, but together with a whole co-creative team and others who you will be hearing more about over the course of this webinar. So that's the overall introduction. I would like to say a little bit of housekeeping stuff. Is we're clearly on Zoom. If you have any questions or anything that you want to contribute, please just throw them in the chat box. If you're able to keep your microphone muted if you're not speaking, then that's quite helpful. And feel free to turn on your camera or not as feels fit. We are streaming live on YouTube. So just keep that in mind. If you feel like turning on your video or anything, this is going to be streamed live, and we are also recording, and we will likely make the video recording available on our platform. So I also wanted to say the plan is for myself and Kate to introduce a little bit of what we've been up to over the past year when talking about downscaling the donut and what are the methods and how are we co-creating and what is this all about. And as well, in the event posting, it says share your thoughts. So what's that? So what we'd like to do is to set the scene a little bit. Then we will hear from Peggy and Sharon from Regenerate Barbados and Yannick Baudouin from Toronto. And then what we'd love to do is to invite you all into some smaller groups forming in breakout sessions to consider a couple questions that will become more clear when we introduce it. And then we'll take a bit of time together there, come back, have any final thoughts. And one of the purposes of this webinar is we'd actually like to kick off an extended consultation period where we're going to be speaking about a handbook, a methodological guide, the next version, so to speak, that we were hoping to receive comments from. So I'll leave it there, and I would love to ask Kate if she has any welcoming comments or anything, please.
Thanks, Andrew. And I just want to say it's wonderful to see everybody here. Thank you for your faith and patience in us, because we were in the wrong Zoom link on the wrong day, wondering where everybody is. And thank you for sticking around and waiting and believing we might show up. And I also want to say there's that lovely feeling of you scroll through the names and some of them you know and some of them you don't know. And it's that lovely feeling of new friends, new places, new connections are just about to happen between Deal and between yourselves. So it's I'm really loving this moment that we're sitting in and looking forward to this session. And I just want to say thank you to Andrew, because what you don't know is that he's been carrying a huge amount of work and care in this process. And I just want to acknowledge the work that he's been doing just to get us to this moment here today. But looking forward to the contributions that everybody's going to bring.
Nice. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate. And yes, I was explaining before the event started that I've been a little bit more frazzled than I have been in quite a bit of time. So I just want to echo that. Thank you all for your patience and for a little bit of the technical difficulties and for staying with us over these first 10 minutes. Would you like to kick off, Kate, with the first part of setting the scene?
Sure. So Andrew and I are just going to pull right back and begin this story closer to the beginning. So we bring everybody in, and I know some of what I'm about to share is very familiar to some people. I hope it's helpful just to hear it one more time, and it may be completely new for others, in which case this is for you. So I'm going to share my screen and pull back and kick off sharing these ideas about downscaling the donut. So this is the process of co-creating methods for localizing the donut to bring it to place that Andrew and I are going to kick off here. And I'm going to just start by pulling us out of this July afternoon in 2021 and say that the whole of the 21st century we know has begun with repeated crises, be it financial meltdown, climate and ecological breakdown, COVID lockdown. We find ourselves in these crises of the systems that we've created. And the reason that Doughnut Economics Action Lab exists is because we believe we all need to equip ourselves with tools that we find helpful for reinventing the systems of which we're a part. And we need to move away from systems of endless expansion towards systems that recognize the deep interconnections between people and the rest of the living world, and indeed between these very crises. So instead of crisis and endless expansion, we bring the donut as one possible compass for human prosperity. The goal is to leave nobody falling short in the hole in the middle, but don't overshoot that ecological ceiling. And so we need to meet the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. And suddenly, instead of pursuing endless growth, we're pursuing a dynamic balance. But we know that we are very, very far from that balance right now, as all of the red in this picture shows us. Now, this donut diagram was first published in 2012, and it's gone through a couple of iterations. But ever since it first came out, people started playing with it. And the big question that everybody asked was, can we downscale the donut to here? It was just very exciting for me to see this happening. The first one popped up in a town called Kokstad in KwaZulu-Natal. And they created their own version of the donut. And if you look at the social foundation, they've added in a wedge called fun. We got the message right from the start. This has to be fun. It has to be fun transforming the places where we live. In Wales, Oxfam started creating one, and there was a workshop held by the Wuppertal Institute in Berlin. They did this lovely empty donut. What would be the city donut? And I found that photograph fascinating for years, thinking, well, how would we fill this in? Some academic researchers in China downscaled it very technically for Lake Erhai region. And it became clear people want to do this. And for years, it wasn't clear how is the best way to go forward, until I found myself listening to the brilliant biomimicry thinker Janine Benyus, who picked up the donut and essentially flipped it inside out. And it was when I heard her talking about it, it inspired me to put her insights and our insights together to create a framework that we think works. And so what we're going to present now is the framework that we feel really does justice to the complexity and the holistic nature of what it means to downscale the donut. So I'm going to lay that out for you here. So can we live in the donut? Imagine wherever you are, the neighborhood or town or city or indeed nation where you are. Take these ideas to where you are. Can we live in the donut? Well, let's unroll it and open it up. And then we can see there's a space between the social foundation and that ecological ceiling. And we can think about here, wherever you are, and our relationship to the rest of the world. And this becomes a canvas for reimagining and remaking our local future. So I'm going to dive in here with an example of a city. And wherever I say city, you can think nation or island or neighborhood or town or village or region. So if we unroll the donut and we think about it inside this space, the question that we invite every place to ask itself is this: how can our city become a home to thriving people in a thriving place, while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And we believe this is the question that all ambitious 21st century places should be asking themselves, that really believe it's time to transform, to belong on planet Earth as a place in connection with all others. And it breaks out into these four lenses. We start with asking, how can all of the people of our city thrive? And how can our city be as generous as the wildland next door? So between the social foundation and that ecological ceiling, these are the local aspirations of this place. But we have to put them in context with any place's global responsibility and its interconnections. So we also ask, how can our city respect the health of the whole planet and the well-being of all people? I'm going to dive us into each of those four lenses so that we get some sense of what it feels like to sit in there and explore it. So let's start with, how can all of the people of our city thrive? And along the bottom, you can see these icons which stand for all of the dimensions we've pulled out of thriving. But like the young people in Kokstad, you could add fun in there if that makes sense where you are. So what does thriving mean to people here? It's a great entry point question. It's going to differ whether we're in Stockholm or Dar es Salaam or Bangalore or Berlin. Different culture, traditions, values, and histories of place mean people have a different vision of thriving. What has COVID-19 made visible? That's a great entry point question. Visible of things that were always there, but now we cannot fail to see and must act upon, whether they're racial inequalities or whose work is essential work, and huge discrepancies of pay and the importance of value that's created. And then which aspect of our culture will be our greatest strength? If we know we need to pivot, how can we dig deep into what already is strong here and use that as the means of pivoting? These are just possible entry point questions, but the idea here is to bring data and metrics to measure and to give some data sense to how are we doing? What is the local social quality of thriving and who is falling short? Then we go to the question of, how can our city be as generous as the wildland next door? So if we would, wherever you are, if we would go to the wild natural ecosystem of the place, what's nature's generosity there? Nature's learned a genius of thriving in that place. Nature's figured out how to cleanse the air and house biodiversity, store carbon and cycle water, harvest energy, regulate the temperature, build soil, and of course, enhance the well-being of humans and other creatures who are there. So how could your city or place aim to match or exceed that generosity? It's a beautiful, wild, but utterly natural aspiration. How could your place store carbon and house wildlife? How could it harvest solar energy? How could it manage and build soil? And of course, the answer to these questions depend utterly on the ecological place where you are located. It's unique on planet Earth. And the beauty is every place is going to find its own answers. So these are the local aspirations. Thriving people in a thriving place. Let's now think of the global context. Think of every place that's embedded in that web of global supply chains, importing food and clothing, electronics, construction materials, consumer goods. Think of the materials worldwide that are used in order to make those products that arrive in your place, and the stream of waste that goes out. And so we ask, how can the city respect the health of the whole planet? And here we have the 9 planetary boundaries, and we need to think and become conscious of the interconnection between our own housing and heating and clothing and food and electronics and their impacts worldwide. So for example, how could we decarbonize energy and mobility in our own cities in ways that reduce our carbon impact on the planet? But also, how do we reduce our material footprint by creating a circular economy, be it through construction in Amsterdam and through food and clothing and electronics? How can we transform, for example, our food systems, which touch upon so many of those planetary boundaries? Again, these are entry points into any particular place, understanding how much are we overshooting planetary boundaries, and therefore how much do we need to come back within? And then lastly, but definitely not least, think of the people involved in those very same global supply chains, who pick and pack the food, who stitch and sew the clothes, who dig and transport the materials, who assemble our phones and laptops. and respecting their rights worldwide. I'd invite every place to ask which companies are headquartered here, whether they're major multinationals or locally owned businesses, and what is the influence of their business practice and their models and their supply chains on the lives of people worldwide. Which brands and retailers are on sale, because they're on sale in every town and city worldwide, and what are the connections that they have to people worldwide? Because the labor behind the labels is very often not as pretty as the brand on the box. And we need to make it visible and realize our interconnections and realize it can be effective. We can improve those connections, respecting people's rights and community rights worldwide. So I'm going to pull out, and those are the 4 lenses, each one with their icons. And you can imagine bringing all of the data that you can gather in your place to actually start quantifying this. You could bring all of your places, your city or nation's targets. What have we already committed to? What standards have we already set for ourselves? And what would it mean to aspire to thrive across all 4 of these lenses? And you can put at the center an issue that's an entry point for transformation, such as your housing future, and ask, what would it mean to create housing here that's affordable, that creates community, that provides childcare, that is accessible and is a good place to live? What would it mean to bring nature back into that housing so that it also stores water and carbon, that it brings back wildlife and creates well-being? What would it mean to create housing, retrofit it or build new housing that actually reduces our footprint on the planet? Can we use circular construction materials? Can we harvest the sun's energy in the way we heat and our homes? And how can we ensure that the materials used and the work that goes into the construction respects workers' rights, whether it's migrant workers coming to the city or people worldwide who dug and made that concrete and those bricks and mortar? As you can see, this framework does not tell you any answers, thank goodness, because the only answers that can come are yours. They come from your place, from your experience, your knowledge, and your specific context. What this framework offers is a holistic way of asking questions, and it invites everybody at the table to see the interconnections between everything. It's those interconnections that help us start seeing the potential, the new opportunities, the synergies, and how everything was always connected. So we created this framework initially in 2019 and had a first go at working with cities in Portland, Philadelphia, and Amsterdam. You can see this is pre-COVID. We worked with city policymakers and community members introducing this framework. And what was really clear in these workshops was people had this palpable sense of relief to be working in a holistic way. And each person had a speciality. They worked on education or equality or housing or transport or heating or decarbonization. And they could put their finger on the portrait and say, this is my place, this is my thing. But then from being recognized, they could also recognize as everybody else's thing. And that was a very powerful source for connection and listening and realizing new interconnections. Of course, this work couldn't continue in person in the same way because of the COVID crisis, but in some ways that's turned out to be a blessing in that it's forcing us to make online tools that we've been developing, and I've just been sharing examples of those. Those are soon going to be released as an online tool by Deal, as a Miro board that you will be able to pick up and use with your community in place and come up with your own innovations and ideas on that framework. Amsterdam is the one city of those 3 that actually picked it up and ran with it and said, well, even though there's a COVID crisis, in fact, because there's a COVID crisis, we're going to go ahead and publish our city portrait. Because when we start to emerge from this emergency, when we start to spend and invest in a recovery package, we need to know which direction we want to go. And they used it to launch their circular economy. So they published their portrait. We held workshops pre-COVID, familiarizing city policymakers with the concepts. They adopted it as a vision for the city of Amsterdam to be a thriving, inclusive, regenerative city for all residents while respecting planetary boundaries. And then they put the donut at the top of their circular policy. So they've used it as a holistic guiding framework for developing a circular strategy in the city. Amsterdam published this in April 2020 in the height of their COVID infection and crisis. And the news went viral internationally, probably because everybody in crisis is searching for a vision of how to emerge. And the idea that this city was putting forward a vision to pivot out of crisis, I think inspired many. So we very quickly released the first version of our city portrait methodology, how we did this. This is the basic approach we took so that anybody could pick it up and replicate it. It's in open source in the Creative Commons. We released it in July, and immediately people started picking it up, and across the world in these places and many others, we were in contact with teams, whether they're working for the city council or indeed led by community members coming together saying, we want to do this here. That was really exciting to us, and was very clear that a lot of practice wanted to get behind this and start seeing what it actually looks like where we do it. And I want to notice one thing here, that it was in Portland, Amsterdam, and Philadelphia that we, the Deal team, with other collaborators, created those first city portraits. But everything that's happened since is being done by the people of that place. And that's the beauty of it. It now belongs in place and is coming from there, innovated out of communities. So in Brussels, the Secretary of State for Economic Transition contacted us and said, could you create one of those portraits for us? And we said, well, actually, we think you should work with an organization of your city who are enmeshed and immersed in participatory networks there. And she said, I know exactly who to find, a wonderful organization called Confluences. And they created beautiful, very visual and accessible downscale of the donut for the Brussels capital region. In the city of Melbourne, they took the concept and held wonderful co-creative workshops with up to 600 people involved in the process, imagining from the start, what is our vision for a regenerative Melbourne? And in Curaçao, they took the concept and have created the Curaçao Island Donut, using it to plot existing metrics on it, a snapshot of where the island is, again, using it at the center of their vision. These three that I just mentioned have been collaborations with the city, but what's also been brilliant, and we've been so inspired by ourselves, is to see what we call Doughnut Action Networks emerging and self-organizing. So groups of residents working in community, from universities and startups and social enterprises and NGOs coming together and saying, let's us make a coalition here, because we are like-minded residents of this place who want to put these ideas into action. It began in Amsterdam. And as with all peer-to-peer inspiration, this triggered so many other groups to say, well, let's get going and do this here. And then these groups began to self-organize and learn together and with and from each other. And again, anybody on this call today, if this inspires you, you can absolutely set up one of these groups too, through the Deal platform. And I want to end by focusing on a wonderful initiative that's happening in Ladywood in Birmingham by one of these local organizations called Civic Square, who have taken the donut and absolutely at the community level are saying, street by street, what does it mean to bring these ideas to life? And actually, I'm delighted I spotted at the beginning of Zoom that Andy Reeve, who you can see assembling that wonderful wooden donut, is on this call right now. So it's great to have you here, Andy. But Civic Square, sometimes people say, what's the smallest scale that you could put donut economics into practice? Well, this is the smallest square we've seen, smallest scale we've seen so far, literally at the scale of a small neighborhood. So don't limit your ambitions for how local it could be or how global it could be. I'm going to stop here and hand over to Andrew, who's now going to talk about what we're doing and how we're learning from this incredible practice that's been bubbling up and inspired us to renew the methodology that we first created.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was just a wonderful story of what we've been seeing and experiencing, and just the energy that has been coming in from all over the world. So I'm going to jump right in to pick up from there on essentially what we have been doing in the interim. So I'm going to share some of the activities that we've been carrying out to adapt this Doughnut Portrait methodology in line with some directions that we actually identified in the very first methodological guide. And these directions were essentially to develop approaches in collaboration with global South cities and places that reflects the context of their needs, histories, interests, and perspectives, to deepen the methodology that we have already applied in global North cities, as well as to adapt this approach, as Kate was just mentioning, to many different scales, whether it's from neighborhood to nation and beyond. And in each case for this, we were already receiving, people, organizations, individuals were signaling interest that this was a direction that they found useful for their particular context. So in this guide, what we were doing was flagging the energy that was already there. So I just wanted to jump in directly on for the Global South process, what we wanted to do was adapt the methodology to take into account the context, the needs, and the priorities in a Global South setting are different from those in the Global North. And as I just mentioned, organizations were signaling interest. And so we recognized that we would need, I'm sitting in Europe, Kate's sitting in Europe, that we're not in a position to be that we needed some co-creative help, so to speak, and ideas from change makers who are actually already applying these ideas in their places and who could explore with us in detail what it would mean to apply these different lenses in their context. And we had potential partners who were reaching out to us from Bangladesh, in the Caribbean, in Barbados, in Curacao, as we just mentioned, in Costa Rica, in India, Malaysia, Zambia, members of the UNDP who have country offices, of course, spread out across many, many countries. And there were others as well. And so if we think of the plan, this was our vision, right? We wanted to adapt this methodology so that we could take into account this context. And so we developed a process, which the first part was to build the team, right? It was to design a co-creative process that we could actually listen and hear the experience from organizations and individuals who had the experience and who are open to this open collaborative approach, and to invite them. And we were incredibly lucky and privileged to be joined by an amazing team. And what we did was build this inspiring and talented team. And we held a series of 5 collaborative workshops that explore the creation of the Doughnut Portrait in detail for each of the lenses. Then the idea was that we could have a draft methodology that we could present to the DEAL community in a public webinar and open up for consultation. And this is actually where we are today. And then following this consultation process, the idea was that we could incorporate comments both from the co-creative process as well as from the DEAL community contributions and come together and publish a Global South portrait methodology. That was the plan, at least. What I've actually discovered, for me personally, there's been a very big learning process of carrying out this co-creative exercise with so many people. I've come from a more academic type of background, academic in a quite a quantitative, I sit at my desk and tap at a keyboard type of way. And so what I have been incredibly privileged is to be learning with these change makers. And what I really found was that the plan doesn't always go exactly as you would hope. So one of the things that we changed right away was, as we were moving, we realized there wasn't enough space to actually hear from the contributors of the team from their own context. So we enlarged the scope to have 6 online sessions instead of 5. And probably most importantly is that we heard quite clearly that when we're speaking about a Global South context, many of the issues and many of the concerns that we were hearing were actually worldwide issues. So what we've now come is to revise this methodology, revise this process to be thinking more in terms of a version 2 methodological guide, as opposed to, separating a Global South and a Global North type of initiative, because we don't actually believe that distinction is very helpful. So that's what we were doing. But when it comes to the co-creative sessions, those 6 sessions, here is just one of those of us at work discussing, thinking about the different methodologies and adaptations that would make sense for Global South context, needs, and interests. And this is just a breakdown very quickly showing the portrait that Kate just showed, how we dove into each of those lenses. So we had a dedicated session for the local social lens, another for the local ecological. And we looked at the global, and then we looked at interconnections across, as well as hearing from our own contributors, their own stories and their own initiatives. And just a couple quick things I'd like to flag related to that. One of the things that we really heard coming out of the breakout sessions was the issue of scale, right? Like, how can we apply this methodology from city to neighborhood to nation? What methodological, how do you define system boundaries? And another one very clearly was power, right? If we're speaking about Global South, Global North, just because I said that the distinction is not necessarily relevant from a methodological perspective. It's very relevant for the lived experience, depending on whether you're in a global south or a global north, because it's different responsibilities, different histories, different power relations, you name it. And finally, the question of diversity, it's just so important to acknowledge, as Kate communicated really, really clearly. The portrait doesn't aim to be a one-size-fits-all methodology. It's asking questions that need to be adapted and answered to each particular context. So just very quick thinking around the question of scale is what criteria we could have for choosing an effective scale. We could think about governance. We could think about interconnections, how it's interconnected with bioregions or with surrounding areas, or other questions. And that's something actually, when we get to the breakout sessions, that you could consider. And if you have any contributions in that sense, to please share them. As well, if you think about power, we have a framework that we are also planning to release a tool come later on in the year for how places, cities, regions can think about the powers that they have to act, as well as the powers that maybe there's a need to form more of an alliance, or how we can recognize different opportunities to act at different scales through purpose, through the networks, governance, ownership, and finance. And finally, this was one of my favorite parts of the co-creative session, was recognizing this question of diversity. If we want to aim to be locally relevant rather than comparable, we asked what would be an alternative to the donut from the culture and the context that you're in. And so actually inviting all of you on the call right now, if there is a donut-y shaped food, then please feel free to throw it in the chat box, and we can add it to our database of donut-y goods. So that is just diving into one last piece from the Global South. Is Kate showed the global ecological lens, and I just wanted to demonstrate really quickly the question we were asking as we presented was, how can this place respect the health of the whole planet? And we can see the icons and the different dimensions within that. But from a Global South context, we can also think of whenever there's an interconnection, there's really two ways. Rather than thinking about how this place respects the health, we can also ask, how can the degradation of planetary health impact this place? And so from a Global South perspective, we were asking, is this a relevant question to ask? If so, what are major impacts? We can think about coral reef bleaching, or ocean dead zones, or sea level rise, etc. So just questions to keep in mind, depending on your particular context. And the last point I wanted to make was that here we were speaking with about Global South co-creative process. We were deeply involved with this team, but we also recognized throughout this that actually there's a lot of energy and a lot of interest in Global North cities that are diving deeper into the methodology, like in Brussels, in Cornwall, in other places. So we organized a series of learning conversations with Global North initiatives from Amsterdam to Barcelona to Melbourne to Brussels, Cambridge and Copenhagen and Cornwall, as well as Toronto. And what we really heard was that this methodology was very useful for their context, but also very challenging because it is so holistic. So these learnings and these experiences are what we've been pulling together in terms of this next version of the handbook that we will be opening up for consultation soon. And then I would just like to wrap up there and invite actually to hear from Peggy and Sharon, who are in Barbados at the moment, and then after that open up for a little bit of questions and answers. So Peggy and Sharon, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Kate, for that presentation. Nice to see you all. Thank you, members of the deal. I'm going to share my screen and talk to you about what we've done here in Barbados. Okay, let's see here. Can you see my screen? Everybody?
Nope,
Not yet. Not yet.
Not yet.
Oh, you can't. Okay, all right. Here, I'm going to go back here and do share my screen. Share screen. I'm allowed to, right? Okay, here we go.
That looks good. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great. Here we are. Okay, sorry about that little glitch there. Okay, so here we are. Those are some pictures around Barbados. And this is just, we put together what we have done just to share with you in this webinar. I'm starting and then Peggy will follow me. We have taken a programmatic approach, and what we have done is, as you can see, we had a launch in February where we invited a lot of people. We did, of course, did all of this online. We had a stakeholder database and we invited a lot of people. And we got a lot of interest and it's very exciting. And so then we followed that with some action scoping. We said, okay, if you're interested, we'd like to hear from you. We'd like to hear what you're involved in and what type of things, what type of actions you think would be good for in Barbados to more conform to more of a donut application. Okay, so we've done the action scoping, and now we are here, and following the action scoping, we came up with 4 areas that we would like to pursue. And the first one is working with women within existing networks of fisherfolk and vegetable vendors to enable them to reflect on elaborate projects to manage their multiple roles. This is Peggy's real interest, and she is going to talk more about that. So working with, on the local level with women primarily, and then the second one, monitoring and lobbying for a transparent management of fertilizer and pesticide use. This was very much interested. Everybody was very interested in this one. And then implementing the Barbados open space system by supporting the development of trails. And we say especially the Barbados Trailway, which is a bicycle tour or a bicycle route all along the old Barbados train track. And then finally, recycling in general and including construction waste by working with contractors, becoming more of a regenerative type of society. Okay, so then we'll go next to action plans, some pilot activities, and then, onward from there. So how do we connect with the donut methodology? We looked at these 4 questions, and we said we would like to begin by the first 2. And then we would look more, the first 2 questions, what would it mean for the people of Barbados to thrive? And what would it mean for Barbados to thrive within its natural habitats? We wanted to start with those first 2. And then as interest and engagement increases, then we would move to question 3 and 4 about what would it mean for Barbados to respect the well-being of people worldwide, or what would it mean for Barbados to respect the health of the whole planet? So with our first, and I'm going to talk to you about the action scoping, we went to people in our sessions and we asked questions around those first two questions. Okay, we looked at the social foundation, and I'm just showing you a couple of photos of local women working in the fisheries, flying fish boners in Bridgetown and sea egg breakers at Bashada. Okay, so the social foundation was that we classified those 4 areas, healthy, connected, empowered, and enabled, into those four categories. And we asked questions of our participants around those areas. We broke them up. We had 4 working groups, and then they took each of those and had people comment on, for instance, I was in the healthy one. So people talked about, what about the food in Barbados? What about the water? What about housing and, and health? And so we had people talk in breakout groups, and we collected their responses. So as to those 4 components, it's not surprising that they're all interconnected, and we believe those will be clear as time goes by. Now, the other group they looked at the ecological ceiling, and we did not discuss, as I said, we did not discuss the external. Water was not discussed because we didn't have anybody show up from water. We invited people to join according to their interests. And although we discussed water in the healthy one, we got a lot of information on that. But we talked mainly about pollution, land use, and biodiversity. So now, learning from the deal, how was the involvement in the co-creative team, how that was useful, and challenges that arise. We see what challenges that arise from that. And I'd like to turn over now to Peggy to talk with you. Are you there, Peggy?
Thank you very much. Yes, Sharon, I need you to move the right. So we were asked to say, what were the insights for Regenerate Barbados? You notice that first of all, we changed, we adopted the idea of Regenerate Barbados because we use the Doughnut methodology. I think the first insight was recognizing the connections between environment and the economy. And I think that that's really the key to dealing with climate change and the crises in the political economy of globalization. So it's what actually attracted me to this group in the very first place. I think too often people don't make those connections. A lot of silos there, a lot of people working on environmental issues, but don't look at social and economic issues. And what is unfortunate when people do that is that they don't notice that when it comes to a choice, between economic interests and social or environmental ones, whenever there's a powerful economic interest at stake or threatened, that always comes first. That always trumps the environmental and social considerations. So we need to pay attention to that. And Doughnut economics starts there, for me, it starts there. The other thing that I found really, really useful about using is the methodology. And methodology both in terms of the questions that are asked and the organization of the data. So I love this quotation: the right questions are more important than the right answers to the wrong questions. I find that a very useful guide. And certainly when we're looking to downscale or adapt Doughnut economics to different scales, the questions are the most important ways, not the answers, but the questions, because the questions can be answered and need to be answered by people in their own locations. For me, the very first foundational questions, how can Barbados be a place where all the people thrive? It's a reminder that not everybody's thriving. So for me, a feminist, social justice activist, that's where I would want to start. Make sure that there is space for the voices of people who are not thriving in Barbados. The question about the environment and the ecological limits, a very important reminder that we just cannot continue to destroy our environment and still continue to live. That in fact, what nourishes us, not just the air we breathe and the water, but the beauty of our island, and also it's our source of livelihood in the Caribbean. Tourism, agriculture, fisheries, all of it environmentally based. We have to take care of that. And then how you organize that data, how to make it manageable. I found very, very helpful those, as Sharon showed, the 4 clusters of healthy, enabled, connected, and empowered. That really helped us in our scoping to separate people into smaller groups, and then to come back together to see the connections between all of those, as Sharon was pointing out. I want to turn to the challenges now. Yes, and the most important challenge, which I don't think that they're necessarily answers to these challenges. I think we could just acknowledge that they're challenges and work on them. So all of this is a process of continuing to engage to address these challenges. But I think it's really important to recognize, first of all, that context is critical. What struck me right away in the very first workshop we had on downsizing the Doughnut was the enormous diversity. You couldn't find a greater contrast, I think, than the contrast between the experience of people in India and Brazil and the people in Barbados. Even within the Caribbean, enormous differences in the context in which the people in Costa Rica are operating and the way in which the people in Barbados are operating. And even within the English-speaking Caribbean, let me say right away that what we're doing in Barbados, it would be much more difficult to do this in any other part of the English-speaking Caribbean. Jamaica, when people think of the Caribbean, they think all the islands are the same. They are very, very different. We have different histories. We have different government systems. We have different governments. All of that makes a difference. So context is really key. The other challenge is the global local connections. And for me, Doughnut Economics and Kate and Andrew's connections at that global level are really important for us to do the things that we can do or we're trying to do at our local level. Because so much of our lives are kind of determined by what is going on at that global level. So for me, it's really comforting to know that there are people like Kate who have access to the corporations, the key influencers, like the Pope, addressing the challenges at that level that in many ways support the local efforts. We were also, I was talking to Sharon about context, and we were thinking that the climate crisis is also context, and the COVID pandemic is also context. And again, for me, what really attracted me to the Doughnut Economics at this particular time is what I call the COVID moment. I think this is really a moment in time when things can happen that were unimaginable before, partly because we actually have no control. You know, Mother Nature is having her way with us, and we're just struggling to survive. That was true also of the climate crisis. But it seems to me that it took a COVID public health crisis to do what even the climate advocates and the climate warriors were unable to do: shut down the entire economies, curtail the amount of travel. So that context of COVID and climate crisis, I want to make the point that it can go either way. It can go, I know I've gone back to the context, because the context within the global local connections, it could be worse. It could get worse, in fact, post-COVID. So those local global connections are really important, that people keep, and particularly in this moment of COVID crisis, there are opportunities at that global level that did not exist before. Things that people like corporations are doing now that are listening, experimenting in a way that they never did before. And I want to end with the biggest challenge of all is understanding history and understanding power. Andrew said that they're working on those issues of power. But for us in the Caribbean, we had to start by remembering our history, the history of colonialism and capitalism. And we can't change that, but we can learn from it. So the first thing that we learned from it, where we first began having this conversation in Barbados, is that the whole landscape of Barbados was changed by colonization. They cut down all the trees to create plantations. All of the wealth of the country was taken out of it. They brought Africans and people from Asia to work in the plantations under the most brutal conditions. So even the questions that we're asking of Doughnut Economics, the situation under colonialism was really, really dire. I think I cannot imagine how you would have a Doughnut Economics project in a situation like that. And I think we have to remember that those we can't change it, but we can learn from it. So what do we have to learn? First of all, I think we can remember that the link between the state and the market has always been a very important connection. And that connection between the state and the market has often facilitated the most brutal and destructive of our environmental practices, and has had a devastating effect on our indigenous communities. So we can recognize the legacies of colonialism persist in neocolonialism, or even when it's not mentioned, they persist. You could see them if you examine the relationships between the North and South right now, between Europe and the Caribbean, for example. And I think we need to recognize the need for regulations to curb the worst excesses of capitalism. So that's one of the things we have to fight for. And I think, again, it's a challenge for doughnut economics, because through doughnut economics, we can perhaps pinpoint those regulations that are most important. And we can try to return to the indigenous knowledge and practices to regenerate our countries and our communities, to do the healing, in fact, that is necessary and will be necessary as we go forward. Of course, not everybody wants to or can take up those challenges. And I'm very struck by the point that Kate and Andrew were making about you can downsize to the very smallest level of a community, of a neighborhood. Personally, I believe that it's at that community level that we have the most control, the most power to act, to make the kind of decisions that we have control over. There's so much that we don't control, but we can control something, our own behavior, our own actions. And it's at that level also that I think there's most opportunity for having fun, for thriving despite everything. And one of the mottos that I have is, how do we organize to live in this world? And to me, that's a kind of a central question that I keep asking myself every time I try to engage with people in my community. So I don't know if that's helpful. I just wanted to, reflect on what some of the challenges going forward are for people who really want to use and find that doughnut economics is really a very, very useful tool for addressing how we organize to live. Thank you very much. Thanks, Sharon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharon and Peggy. That was really, really very helpful and useful, certainly useful for you to share the challenges that you've been facing, or that the doughnut economics helps shine a light on, as well as bringing your own experience. It's wonderful to hear about the scoping workshops, and that was helpful as well. So thanks for sharing all of that. If there are any questions, I haven't seen any questions that showed up in the chat box, but maybe if anyone's thinking about it, I was curious to hear about if there were any next steps that you were planning to make in this more programmatic approach that you're taking. Are there more scoping sessions, or are you planning to create a portrait from a methodological perspective, or what's the plan?
Those 4 areas for next steps were what we were going to do. We were going to form Slack groups around those key areas and invite people to join them, and then continue the conversation and see what arises. That's our next step. We've written a report on the session, and that's where we're at right now.
Perhaps I could add to that. Here's where we come back to the context, because in Barbados, because we are so small and people are so accessible to each other, because we have a government that is very social justice oriented, despite a debt crisis, we have an IMF agreement, so that limits a lot of what governments can do. Despite the fact that we depend on tourism, and that's all gone, we do have a government that is is trying to live that legacy, from our post-colonial. So there's a lot of work that's going on in those areas, in all of the areas. The data is there. In our scoping events, for instance, we recognize that a number of people are working on some of those. And one of the things that we talked about and we have to work on is to see to what, first of all, identifying that there are a number of people that are doing some of that work, a lot of that work, both on the social foundation and on the ecological limits. One of the organizations, in fact, that Doughnut Economics came out of is CERMES. That's the environmental group that Robin Mahan headed, and which is really like our host for the work that we are doing in Barbados. They've been doing incredible work in mapping and in collecting data and in actually working on some of those issues. So we wanted to explore the possibility of identifying different groups in civil society, even and in the quasi-governmental area, that are working on these issues, and to invite them and to suggest to them that maybe Regenerate Barbados could be a kind of an umbrella, so that there are many different projects and initiatives, to recognize those initiatives and to invite the initiatives to consider whether being part of this larger network, which shares certain values about the values of environmental and social and economic and then justice, whether they would find it useful to be part of this larger network. So that's the question we have. And that would be the way in which we would develop that portrait, I think. Whether people want to join us, I don't know. Maybe I could just say a little bit about my particular interest, which is in the social foundation, and why we've chosen that particular project going forward. Because we cannot do everything, but we've picked the issue of working with women specifically. So CERMES has done a lot of work on gender in fisheries, and there is a network, an organization of fisher folk in Barbados, actually headed by a woman. There's an organization of vendors in Barbados. We want to recognize that the informal sector of the economy is where a lot of people, most people, are in that informal sector. And the people who are not thriving are all in that sector. Their livelihoods are very precarious. So we want to work there. And we narrowed it down to working with those two networks, because women within those two networks. And one of the reasons that I want to work there with women is because when you talk to women who are in fisheries, or women in agriculture, or women in vending, they talk about themselves as producers. They do not bring in the rest of their lives. And yet we have to deal with that double day, the dual role, because what they can do in the fish market and in vending and in the fields and in the factories is very much determined by the kind of support they have in their role in social reproduction. So this project will allow me to build on what has been there before, where women are only thinking of themselves as producers, to invite them to think of themselves and their work that they're doing in social reproduction. And what are some of the projects, what are some of the facilities, the services that would help them to manage those dual roles better? And then at a macro level down the line, one of the things I would love to do is to, again, talk to people in those networks about what sort of policies at the level of social security they would like to see. So first, to empower the women to figure out what policies, what they want to see at that policy level. Then to negotiate with their networks, to sensitize their networks to these things. So working with the women in these networks would amplify their political voice and enable them to strengthen the capacity of the networks themselves to address the issues of gender, and in that way, benefit the entire society. One of the challenges I always have as a feminist activist is that people say, well, you're only looking out for the women. I'm not only looking out for the women, I'm looking out for the whole society. But you cannot look out for the whole society while ignoring the realities of women. So let me stop there because as Kate and Andrew know, and Sharon, if you get me on my, it's hard to stop me. So I stop right there.
Thank you so much, Peggy and Sharon. Yes, it's very, very inspiring to hear from you and to hear from your experience and to hear a feminist activist pushing for change in Barbados. So it's very clear, and we will, well, I'm just privileged and honored to be a small part of that work. So let me pass on to Yannick, and to share a bit of story from where he is, which is in Toronto, to hear a little bit of a different perspective. So please, Yannick.
All right, thank you, bonjour. And first off, Peggy and Sharon, thank you so much. I mean, so many of the principles and the ideas and the sharing you just did relate, even though it's a city far up in Canada. I think the society aspects, and especially the feminist economics aspect, are really, really important as we move forward. So I'll first share my screen. It's always the moment of truth. Does it work? Does it not work? We did test it, so it should work. Here we go. Let me know if you see it. Thumbs up, somebody, and we're good. Yes? All right, excellent, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, so bonjour à tous. My name is Yannick Bourdouin. I'm a director of innovation then for Ontario and North at the David Suzuki Foundation. And as Andrew had started earlier on too, first want to really acknowledge the land that I have my feet on. Actually, I'm on the 6th floor of a building, so I'm floating above the lands, the traditional territories of many First Nations, the Wendat, the Chippewas, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee. So this area, these lands are rich in culture, rich in wisdom, rich in knowledge. And I'll definitely touch upon that as we present a little bit today. I also take a moment to acknowledge my own father's traditional lands, which from the Algonquin Nation of Kitigan-Zibi near what is called Ottawa today. I'm taking a slightly different approach maybe today. I wanted to sort of share sort of the origin story. How did we get from the discussions of, the whole world of sustainability in Toronto? It's been on for decades, right? We've talked about it, we tried this, we do this, we have this, we want to have. So what was it now that led to this moment where that powerful visual, the story that the donut can tell, has now connected with some of our decision makers, also in community and all that. So I wanted to start a little bit off with some fun facts, get a bit into the landscape, the social landscape, the cultural landscape of Toronto, move into a little bit of the donut experience so far, and then leave you as well with the challenges. And these are challenges I've noticed. I'm not saying they're the challenges for everybody, but just what I've been noticing in that space. So I also wanted to put a winter picture up there because, of course, Toronto being where it is, spends a lot of time in the dark and in the winter, but we still have a lot of fun with it. And I also want to just mention, I myself am not from Toronto, I'm from Ottawa. And so there's an ongoing Ontario rivalry. We have the way better hockey team in Ottawa, so we won't debate that with any Torontonians on the line. And just a little bit of ways of background for myself. I'm an economist and a geologist. Originally, my main academic background was in geology out there in the world. I spent about a decade in industry. I know, extractive industry. Oh no, Yannick. And then into the UN system. And now about 3.5 years ago, moved back to Canada after 15 years away. And am now in Toronto for the David Suzuki Foundation, which is one of Canada's biggest environmental organizations. So some fun facts about Toronto. It has the title, I guess, of a mega city. In North America. It's the 4th largest metropolitan area in North America. It's got 3 million people in the city itself, 6 million in the greater area. In 2019, it was the top of the crane index. So the most construction cranes in the metropolitan area in North America. So I don't know if it still holds that title. I don't know if that good or bad, just saying, fun fact. It's also the most tree-covered, I didn't even know that until recently, the most tree-covered urban area in North America, or mega city urban area in North America. So that's some little fun facts to get us started. Where did we start on, let's call it the journey towards donuts, new ways of thinking about the economy, all that kind of work. And that really started about 3 years ago in town halls. We went out and asked people. We simply asked things like, what is the purpose of the economy? And when we got no answers, well, at least I didn't get any answer. It was very fascinating. And these were a lot of town halls in the Toronto area by chance. And so then I would ask the question again, what would you like the purpose of the economy to be? And then stuff started flying on the walls, white walls were filled, all kinds of conversations were happening all over the place. And this was kind of where we, as a foundation, kind of got inspired. How do we help bring about some of that reimagination? How do we help align the expectations people have for an economy with the actual act of having an economy? And so, as I said earlier, the starting point isn't new. It's not a blank space that we're starting to fill. It's not a blank canvas. Takaronto is an area, pre-colonialism, which is filled again with wisdom, experience, knowledge. And we have to recognize that all these nations prior to about 400 years ago, ecologically speaking, were well in the donut. All right, there was no idea that you would operate beyond the relationship you had with nature. And I'm using the past tense here, very acknowledging that it isn't the past. This still exists today. It is still active today. There are vibrant communities today. And this is an important source of teachings that we have to start listening. And so again, when we're thinking about sustainability in Toronto as a new thing, it isn't new. It's new in the sense that for the last few hundred years, we've now had to deal with something that wasn't here for millennia and millennia before. And so one of my most inspirational economic textbooks these days, not written as an economic textbook, but for me is a book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, a First Nation knowledge keeper, and also a botanist trained in the Western worldview. But I love her quote, "If all the world is a commodity, how poor we grow. When all the world is a gift in motion, how wealthy we become." And that to me is sort of the story we're trying to get to, right? Especially in the Western way of thinking. So it's always to acknowledge that the economies that were here prior to colonialism were in balance. And that is an important piece to start from. Toronto itself is a global gateway city, 140 to 180 spoken languages in Toronto itself. The world is here. That means the source of imagination is endless. The source of creativity, of lived experience, of worldviews, all of it is here. So if we're going to recreate an economic paradigm, wow, this is a place to start, right? And I had to put a Caravana festival picture here because it is one of my personal favorite, funnest festivals in Toronto, celebrating Latin and Caribbean cultures. And it's impossible to not have fun at Caravana. So I put it in there. And also, of course, this is a picture of when you do happen to win a basketball championship, a city like Toronto goes absolutely insane. But again, to show you how vibrant socially and culturally Toronto is, often very undervalued by government systems, by the power systems that we have in place, blind spots to that sometimes. But the reality when you walk through a city like Toronto is very, very different. Toronto is a community. It's communities of change. And it's been trying and doing, not just trying, it's been doing all kinds of right livelihood, donut livelihood, sustainable livelihoods for very, very long time again. From arts and environment to cultural backgrounds, to repair cafes, to tool libraries. So none of this is new. The main challenge is it doesn't turn into the main flow of the river. And most people don't know why. We don't see the thing that's pushing back against us. And so when we kind of put together the idea for, so again, to me, the donut for me was a powerful story waiting to be told, not necessarily only the technical side, but that story, the myth that busts some of the myths, not just some of the myths, a lot of the myths, the falsehoods that are entrenched in a worldview that we're still stuck with. And so for us, it's part of a broader picture. We're not just working at the city level. We are looking at reimagining paradigm at a country level and hopefully someday at a global level. But down in Toronto, the starting point is really a tale of two cities. And I just look kind of always referencing that because these are the two cities. So on the right, this is how people live. And then on the left, this is how we get governed. And that's the challenging, that's the blind spots that we don't always see. You can walk through a lived experience in Toronto and the systems, the governance, the economics that doesn't see that, and yet is still the predominant operating way of doing things. And so when we started to work with Deal on these issues, and Kate and I kind of go back to Schumacher College is where I met Kate the first time. This to me was one of the most important parts, right? The identities that decision makers have. We often think decision makers are just decision makers. They're politicians, they get elected, they're senior city staff, but no, right? Every individual has a complete mix of all these identities. And how do you surface the more intuitive and emotional identities rather than the overly relying on the technical, brain-oriented, data, quantitative, academic? Peggy was having a nice, before this we were talking about academia. It's great. And so that to me was the most powerful landscape, the place we have to put some saplings in and let them grow. And so in Toronto, yes, we've gone through some processes already, a few great workshops, a teaser way back in January last year, and then moved into kind of a more proactive. We have a champion city councillor, Councillor Layton, who's just been on this for so long. His father is a very was a very well-known politician in the federal landscape on moving into these spaces of social equity and environmental equity. And so that's what started, that's what's in progress. And the kind of the next steps going forward on this are now more to link not just the city government system, but how do you start bridging and creating new, more participatory decision-making processes with community itself. And sort of like Amsterdam's approach to the coalition, we're going to start to put those little pieces into play as well, and hopefully have that not just as an engagement piece for city government, but actually part of city governance. And again, I'm not saying that any of this is new, right? There are moments in time where the things we've been doing for a long time suddenly come into play and get absorbed. And I do feel, but I would never want to use the word COVID and opportunity in the same sentence, but for lack of English possibilities, there is an opportune moment in time. Systems have been so disrupted that there's an appetite to not just analyze something differently, but to actually do different. And when it comes to things like policy process, we could do it pre-COVID style, or we could do it post-COVID style, whatever post-COVID might look like. And again, this is where these processes, these ways of sitting around a table together and not just using data to, like research reports to analyze the city of Toronto, but the actual lived experience of people around that table beyond their professional roles only. Also as them being residents of a city, being part of the diaspora of the city. But some of the challenges, I guess, and these are things, again, personal opinion, my experience only, very selfish of me, but I'm just kind of relaying what I've noticed. And it's not just with Toronto. My UN life was very much facing or noticing the same challenges. And these are things that are perhaps where some of the deeper questions have to come about. Shifting from an entrenched way of thinking and doing is very difficult. And that's not going to be a technical narrative that can change that. It really has to get back into writing, creating, and telling new stories together. And that's hard, right? It moves right into the same kind of dissonance that we feel. Decision makers want something different, but taking that leap into the unknown, right? How do you do something differently? Well, take a risk. Risk. Fear, right, is a huge challenge. How do you overcome fear? How to authentically invite and embed diverse worldviews. I mean, we like in Canada to talk about it. We like to politically, oh yes, we must do this. We have reconciliation, we have that. But as soon as you get into a deeper closed room conversation about recognizing that all worldviews are equally as valuable, ooh, that's a difficult one. So that's still a big challenge to help get out of the old thinking, to start embracing the fact that, well, that old thinking was only based on half of one worldview, right? A couple hundred white guys that look like me. How do we now start to recreate these systems based on recognizing all lived experience, context, and worldviews? Ooh, very difficult. And that kind of led to that. Who knows if Einstein actually said this? There's all kinds of conspiracy theories that he didn't, but we're still stuck as decision makers, as influencers, even in change enablers, in change enabling or the environmental sector, our charities. We want something different, but to take that leap to do it differently is still a challenge. We remain programmed to stick with the familiar. And so those are our key challenges that are really out there. There's many more, I'm sure. And those challenges for me are also the source of opportunity, obviously, because I think if we can deepen the questions, and again, the donut becomes a visual pathway into those deeper questions. We all want to be in the donut. We all want to be sustainable. I mean, I have not met somebody yet, corporate or not, who wakes up in the morning saying, how can I screw the world more today? How can I create more pollution? How can I create more climate change? No one that I've ever met wants that. Well, maybe one ex-president, but who knows? That is where the opportunity then lies. How do we get deeper into, okay, we've been trying it for 30 years one way, 40 years. Maybe it's the way that's the challenge, right? How do you now turn the pathways? How do you connect with wisdom holders from, again, different worldviews who do literally have, could do this differently. How do you create relationship? How do you move from the quantitative to the qualitative? And although it's still very, very challenging in the Western way of thinking, I think the cracks are in the wall, and I think we're starting to see the ability to move into those space, not preach, not be prescriptive, but really create those co-innovation spaces. So thank you from our founders.
Wow, thank you so much, Yannick. Very well done. Thank you for sharing all these insights, for the challenges that you're seeing in Toronto, and as you said, bringing in from the United Nations, from your what was it, your geology background? Oh no, and more. So thank you very much for that. I am seeing any questions. We also are running a little bit late on time, mainly because we had those technical difficulties at the beginning and everything, and I haven't seen any immediate direct questions for you. So I was thinking, I just see a question there. Oh, I was thinking of actually just diving right into the next piece, which is inviting other people's contributions from those who are going to be a part, if that's okay. So let me just reiterate, thank you for all of those insights. And we're definitely going to be in touch and hearing about the next steps. So I have another slide where I wanted to present a little bit of what we had in mind for the breakout sessions. And the reason for that, I feel like I've been mentioning this city portrait methodology, but I'm kind of hoping, I guess we were trying to read the audience of who would be coming to a co-creating methods webinar, and we're hoping that you are quite familiar with the portrait methodology to an extent. So this is the methodological guide that we published in July 2020. And as you can see on the other side, what we really did was we aimed to describe what happened in Amsterdam, in Philadelphia, and in Portland. And what I described since then is how we've been trying to learn from and adapt with the co-creative sessions by learning from Global North cities that are already in action. And what we're aiming to do is then bring those learnings into a version 2 of this methodological guide, which dives into the analysis of how you could go into creating each of the lenses that we've seen so far. So key pieces are, we identify targets and we identify current performance. And that's, that's integral to the donut, as well as when you localize it to a place. And so for each of those lenses, that's what the methodological guide does. And that's what the handbook that we're aiming to produce will also do, except bringing into account, of course, that we don't have clear answers for any of these particular ways, because we want to acknowledge that there are many different entry points. And really, it's a tool for transformative action. It's not seeking to just show a snapshot for its own sake. It's saying, how can we create transformative action, which is, urgently needed in this pivotal decade. So this is, I'm just showing a screenshot of what the consultation document looks like right now. And we're going to open it up for, over for a 6-week period, basically starting right now, and aiming to publish the handbook version 2 in the fall. So essentially what we're asking for the breakout sessions is, if you're familiar with this portrait methodology and the lenses that you've seen so far, then we could ask about these core questions where it says, and maybe even if you're not so familiar with it, but you could still, having seen what those 4 lenses are, do you have any specific questions that you think we could address in the handbook? And again, thinking from a methodological perspective, where we're trying to show different options of how you could answer those 4 key questions. How can all the people of this place thrive? And the local ecological, the global ecological, and the global social. So do you have any specific questions that we could address in the handbook that are, on your mind that you could discuss with your team, as well as, do you have any specific indicators, or do you have experience that you could bring in terms of indicators or data sources or methods that you could share based on your own context and your own understandings? So that's the idea. We're going to ask you to join smaller groups for about, not very long at this point. I'd say 15, 20 minutes or so, but I'll pass to Rob to explain how the breakout sessions work.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so we've got we're going to go for 18 minutes, somewhere between 15 and 20. And you're going to be put into automatically into groups of 4 other wonderful people from this call from around the world. So these are the 2 questions you have. Enjoy discussing them. If you capture which room you're in, you can find the associated room slide. There's 1 slide per room, and someone can take notes, someone could share their screen. Both those things are possible. There's a timer in the top right, so you can keep a tab on how much time you've got left. The link again is in the chat. So have fun discussing those 2 questions, and see you all in 18 minutes.
Well, welcome back. Thank you all. I hope you had interesting discussions. We have another few moments that I wanted to take I keep mentioning about this consultation process. I guess now is the moment of truth, where I would love to open that up officially for the very first time by sharing my screen one last time. And this is what I showed earlier, which is just a screenshot, of course, of the consultation document that we have been working on. And I need to say that there is, we were chatting a little bit before, that I'm almost thinking of myself as a recovering academic, and that I need to be more like an aspiring intellectual, in the sense of trying to let go and open things up that they don't need to be perfectly done, especially if it's a consultation, because if you do that, then it almost feels like people's contributions are, they're not coming in at the right moment, when you feel like you're showing up at a later point. So the purpose of this consultation is really to take us, now I can't see the chat box. I'm going to share in the chat right now, the link, and then I'm going to share my screen to walk us through a little bit of what this document is and present what we have in mind in terms of what we're asking for. So, or what we're inviting people to contribute towards. So let me do that. You should be able to see my screen now. And those of you who are wanting to join this Google Doc document, welcome. So essentially what we have done is taken the first version of the methodological guide, and we've been working on it based on these learnings that I've already mentioned several times. So key things to note is that we're inviting contributions, and the way that we would like and we would love, and we're very grateful for contributions, is via comments in the section. So Google Docs doesn't have a way that you can currently not, disable the track changes so that for inline suggestions. But what we're asking, and what you'll see in bold here, is that people, if you have any comments or anything whatsoever, please do so by making a comment to the side, where if, for example, as I've just done here, it highlights the text and you can just write in whatever you want. The reason for that is that if you start putting in suggestions in the text, it starts getting difficult to actually read. And the point of this is, once again, this document is very much in progress, and we welcome contributions. There are many changes to the flow and to the tone and the things that we would like to add, but we would also really like to hear from you as early as possible. And this is essentially as early as it could possibly be, where we can feel like there's an overall structure that people can follow. On the left-hand side, you can see an overview, like any Google Docs, if you're familiar with that, where you can dive into each of the different sections. Here's the purpose. Here's some principles where you can see, for example, we have not yet inserted the principles. However, those will be coming soon. And then we start diving into each of the lenses in terms of a methodological perspective on each of the dimensions that we looked at, while also bringing in some of the learnings from, for example, Regen Melbourne or Barcelona, or the Global South co-creative process. So that's what I wanted to present about that. We're, as I said, we're inviting contributions over, we're hoping to publish in the autumn of this year. So this is like going to be a 6-week process. So please take a look at your leisure, and we welcome your thoughts. And I'd like to invite Kate if she has any comments to share about this as well.
Just to say that we really want to embrace this open process. This is very much a document in the process of rewriting. And as ever, we would always imagine we wanted to get further along, but we just decided, rather than try and hold it back, let's open this up to this community in the spirit of sharing pieces of work that are in process. So please look at it and think, what do I actually, if I really want to do this where I am, what is not at all clear to me? What is not coming across here? What else do we need to know? And what's already clear to me that's missing here, and that will be really valuable insights, resources, advice, things to keep in mind, examples for others to learn from. That's what we want to create. It's version 2. It's not final. Everything that we create is a version. So we are going with the spirit of it's good enough for now and safe enough to try. Let's put it out and let's keep learning again from what's still going to be missing so that we keep moving forward. So we're very much embracing this spirit. Really hope that you'll contribute to it. We're holding another webinar like this one tomorrow for people from the other series of time zones, more linear across Asia. So we're going to have a whole other set of contributors. This is the first time we've worked in this way. This is the first document we've opened in such a collaborative way. So please join us. We really hope that this can also be an inspiration to other organizations to open up and share more and collaborate more and be more open in the process of creation. Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I think at this point then I would love to also acknowledge that there were questions in the chat, and if they're particularly related to the methodological questions, then you now know that this consultation document is available, that you can post them there. We had the Google Slides. I would love to thank Peggy and Sharon and Yannick for sharing your stories and your experience. It's been fascinating and wonderful, and we've learned so much from you, and we will continue to do so. And to thank the Deal team as well for supporting this whole process, and of course to thank everybody who has joined us this morning, evening, or afternoon. So on that point, I think I can bid you all adieu and say thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Adios.
you.